Welcome. My name is Ray Leung and I'm the Category Capability Manager here at the IGD. I'll be sharing with you some processes, tools and tips on how to build and tell a compelling story with insights. Here's a couple of things I'll be covering over the presentation. Tailor the story to your audience. Thinking about the focus on insight and rather than numbers. Understand the structure of storytelling using the 5Cs framework. And finally, translate those learnings into practice. So just to recap, we're going to be really focusing on understanding the audience, focusing on what is really an insight, thinking about the structure, and really thinking about how we can translate all of those things into practice. So let me start with the story. It's about the very first time actually I had a buyer's meeting, which was many years ago. I spent days building a PowerPoint, getting all my graphs ready, making sure my numbers stacked up, things that you guys will be familiar with. And then the big day arrived. After the initial formalities, about weather, family, traffic, parking issues, etc., I handed over the buyer a copy of my presentation and started to take them through it. About 15 seconds later, actually what I noticed was the buyer ripped out the last page which contained my recommendations and put the rest of my presentation onto a pile of other ones that suppliers had presented. And then they proceeded to put crosses and ticks against my recommendations page. We spent the rest of the meeting actually really talking about those things that she marked out. And then when I asked the buyer, why did you actually request all the numbers and didn't actually really bother looking at the detail? Well, the response was actually quite interesting. What they said was, actually, everybody gets the same numbers. So actually the insights themselves probably should be broadly similar. If she'd actually spent time going through the numbers, then I'd probably fudged the numbers somehow. So she was happy with my numbers. The other thing that she thought about was actually the things that were different. And they were my insights and recommendations. Actually, my recommendations look slightly different from other suppliers. And so actually they wanted to spend more time understanding why those differences were. And that leads me then to some of the learnings I had from that episode. Number one, numbers and graphs don't distinguish you. It's what you infer from them that does, and they are typically the insights. And also, how do you bring those opportunities to life? Is through your action planning. And again, that's part of your USP that you can deliver in your storytelling. And then finally, people by nature are cynical, and don't give them a reason not to trust you. So if I ask you a question, think about a film, a book, a presentation you recently watched or observed or looked at, and something that really grabbed your attention. What was it that really drew your interest and made you remember it? Just tapping your answers on the screen. So there's a bar in the actual box, and if you could just type in some of the things, we can just see them through, and they're starting to trickle through now. Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you for that. So there's a couple of things that are really starting to come through. A bit around the characters that were involved, the humor, the plot, the thing about the story as well. All really useful things to think about. And actually the emotional piece as well. Lots of things, great answers, thank you for that, in terms of what really drew your attention. And I want you to really hold those and think about those things that you typed in today when we think about actually building our stories. So what I really want to focus on, and actually some of those answers that you gave there on the screen really build into these three key things to consider when we talk about building compelling stories. Number one, the audience. Actually know the audience that you're speaking to. Number two, think about the insight. What's the aha moment that's really going to inspire action? And number three, really think about how you deliver that story in the form of the structure that you can present it within. And actually, they're the three things that I'm going to talk about over the next couple of slides. So, know your audience. Let's go through my first thing, know your audience. Why are they all different? Your challenge as a storyteller is to understand and appreciate those differences. If you like numbers and graphs, it doesn't mean the person on the other side of the table necessarily will do as well. In fact, many people don't really like seeing lots of numbers and graphs, unless of course you're very analytical. If you're presenting to somebody who's very logical, you might present, yes, numbers and graphs and facts, but actually spend more time thinking about actually what does that mean? How can you build that practically? What does it actually look like? And a conceptual person might like the big ideas, the blue sky thinking, and numbers are just detail that really get lost. And so for these people, really think about how do you actually present your story to them. And there's loads of other ways that you could view people through different prisms: personable, logical, introvert, extrovert. Whatever the dimensions are, a great story is one that is tailored to the audience. And that's my number one key consideration for you guys to think about is know your audience. What makes them tick? Actually, how do they like to be presented to? The second part about knowing your audience is very much around knowing what's in it for them, or what's in it for me with them. Again, you need to understand what makes your audience tick, because chances are you need them to do something either through implementation or action post that meeting. For example, what motivates the audience that you're speaking to? They might be looking for a job promotion. So you need to build a story that'll help them set them apart from others, drive strong outperformance, for example, and really help them achieve their goals of that promotion. If it's to improve sales, again, think about how you're going to drive their sales ahead of others potentially. Within is really important because it's really going to motivate somebody to actually do something. And within storytelling, actually you want to land something and want them to do something afterwards. So understanding how they like to be engaged and what motivates them is really important when we think about knowing your audience. The second thing to consider is the insight itself. What is the aha moment? Now, I'll be honest, a lot of presentations I see usually start with a similar narrative. Shares down, sales are down, performance is behind, followed by a recommendation on how to increase product sales. And actually, if you close those gaps, there'll be an opportunity of X, Y, and Z. That is typically the kind of threads of presentations that I see and observe. However, a graph and a chart aren't insights. What you don't do is plan off a chart or a graph. Data, in fact, is a support. The insight is what you should be planning off. If you really think about what is an insight, and we'll go on to this in the next section, it's super important to realize that actually data, graphs, and charts do not drive action. The insight itself should drive action. So, what is an insight? Here's a really simple tool for you guys to look at or reference every time you look at the insights that you've generated to see actually, is it really an insight? Number one, think about where is that insight coming from? Is it thinking about the consumer, the customer, or the shopper? Three broad buckets where insights could be derived from. Then we need to think about the need, the want, and the value. A need is you can't live without it. A want might be a desire or willing to go the extra mile to have. And a value is willing to pay more for. So then what is an insight? An insight itself could be formally structured as shoppers, consumers, or customers need, want, value. If you use that sentence as a starter, it'll help you drive and deliver a true meaningful insight. So again, a great little tool there and framework to utilize when thinking about constructing insights back at your own offices. Another really useful tool to really understand if you've got an insight or not is this. When I look back at my old work and I was presenting, I probably wasn't actually presenting insight. And I say that because actually every time I presented something that I thought was an insight, the buyer would always ask why. I would say because performance is driven by brand X, and the buyer would say why. Then I would say, well, actually, because brand X has seen reduced distribution. The buyer would ask why. Well, because it's got reduced distribution because you reduced it. Why? Because it was stealing sales from other brands. Why? Because all brands are providing the same flavors, so we're just seeing switching of sales. Yeah, but why? Because the shopper wants a broad range of unique flavors. Interesting. Let's launch more flavors. So it's a really useful tool to utilize, but a really simple check as well is that questioning, utilizing the why technique to really drill down and understand whether you have an insight or not. And actually, it's so useful and so simple all at the same time, which is get your colleagues to go through a presentation that you've pulled together or a story that you've built where you think you've got insight, and use this why framework. And actually, if you can't get any further, then you've probably reached an insight. It's annoying, I know, but it actually really does work. Now, the final thing that I want you to consider is the structure itself. Most stories have a flow, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we use a similar approach here at the IGD, which we call the 5 C's framework. Over the next section, we'll help you understand also within that 5C framework where to utilize data, charts, insights, and actually some of that whiffing or that opportunity for that particular audience that you've crafted, and where to put them into each point of within that structure. So a simple 5C approach is, what's the current situation? Creating that need, a simple call to action, the commercial benefit, and actually the close. And if we think about how to utilize the 5C framework to guide us when we think about our insights, when we think about our charts and numbers, and we think about our action planning, actually there's some key places where we utilize some of those things. Within the current situation, we should really be putting our graphs and data and charts to really underpin and understand what the current situation is. When we think about the need, that's your aha moment. That's where you should be placing your consumer, customer, shopper needs, want, values insight into this section here. And finally, when we think about what do we want to drive and how are we going to drive it, this is where your action planning really comes into its own. And then the piece around the commercial benefit is very much within the within. What does it deliver specifically for that audience that you're talking to? So in this section, I really want to then talk about how you could utilize this structure to start tailoring time and building certain emphasis on elements of the 5 C's. For example, you might think about the 5 C's as elements of time. So 20% across those 5 areas represent your hour of time, and you might want to give equal weighting of each one. However, if you really understood your audience, you would think about tailoring certain sections of that and dialing down and dialing up certain sections of your 5C. So let me give you an example of that. If you were presenting a story to a logical and highly analytical thinker, you might think about presenting numbers and graphs over really putting lots of big images and lots of conceptual thinking in place. But what does that mean practically? Well, in terms of time itself, you might spend a bit more time thinking about the current situation, because actually as an analytical thinker, they'll want to know the detail. They'll want to understand actually what's driving the market and what's generating that need. And then when you really think about the insight itself, they're going to have to want to understand and start unpicking and understanding actually what's driving that insight. And so actually it's really important then to think about putting more time and emphasis on that current situation, the insight or the need, and actually a really simple call to action as well. Because for these guys, the analytical thinkers and logical thinkers, they're going to want a plan of action, but they're also going to want to understand why that is the case. In this example, we think about a conceptual thinker. And here in this example, we've got a highly developed relationship where actually the audience trusts you implicitly. And so in that regard, actually there probably isn't as much need to really present lots of numbers, graphs, and figures. So we can dial back some of that current situation. Actually, really where they want to spend time maybe is thinking about the big idea, is to think about how they can bring it to life together. And actually even that piece around commercial benefit or the whiffing piece might be not in the mix whatsoever. Really what they want to do is have a great discussion and want to really understand some of your thinking. And so again, when we think about tailoring our story and when we think about delivering it, we need to think about how we place certain emphasis on certain ones of the C's. The 5C model is an invaluable tool. It provides not only the structure, but it also helps you allocate the time and place emphasis on certain areas where you know your audience will want to listen to. So, what makes a compelling story? Consider the audience that you're telling the story to. As I've talked about earlier, people like to learn in different ways, and actually your relationship with the audience is going to guide you in terms of how much detail you put in, where do you place that detail, and actually what types of information or insights are you going to be talking to them about. Second area that I really want you to remember from this presentation is actually data and information set the current situation, but insights will create that need. The other thing I want you to remember is actually data and information will not set you apart necessarily. The insight itself will set you apart and really drive competitive advantage when you think about telling a compelling story. And the final bit I really wanted to cover off is the emphasis within the C's. If we think about where you want to spend time or when you're building your compelling story, know your audience. What makes them tick? What do they like to do and listen to? Because actually you don't need to spend an equal amount of time against each one of those 5 C's. The structure itself should give you enough guidance to help plan your time accordingly and place emphasis on certain areas. So when we think about that word tailoring, the 5C really comes into its own. Okay, and that brings us to the end of this webinar. Hopefully you found that really useful, and thank you for your attendance today.